Radio silence flipped the script, guys. Scream 6 is here, and somehow this creative team have figured out how to create something genuinely new to highlight their voice, but still create something that feels organically a part of the Scream franchise. They know they don't need to be Wes Craven, nor should they try to be. Franchises are built upon ideas that offer a lot of latitude to mix things up, to be creative and take risks. Take advantage of that. Don't fall into the pit of trying to please all fans. That's a battle that you will never win. Star Wars will concur.
Ray Skywalker.
The franchises and their respective fan bases that root themselves under a ceiling and can't mature with the art they love are the problem. Scream, even in its weakest moments, has never been stagnant. That's worth celebrating. And Scream has been an institution for a quarter of a century now, which is just mind-blowing to think about. It has changed over 6 films. If it hadn't, there wouldn't be 6 films, and there sure as hell wouldn't be a new one in theaters right now in 2023. And as Scream fans, sure, we can rail against it, consider the well poisoned, consider canon ruined, and insist that these aren't Scream movies, or that radio silence is making bad films and it should have ended with Wes Craven. There must be someone, at least one solitary person, who sees that Scream 6 takes place outside of Woodsboro in New York City and goes, nope, I'm not watching it, f that movie. I don't think that's the case. I like to think that Scream fans are generally more open-minded and rational, aware that you grow by accepting change and embracing it, but I mean, who knows? Maybe there are people who just want Scream to be one thing. But the malleability of these movies has kind of always been the appeal. The way they play with our preconceived notions, with genre expectations, that seems like it has always been a part of the Scream franchise. They're tailor-made for an audience who doesn't want to know what the course of the whole story is from the very first frame, and who, even if they speculate, are almost certain to be some degree of wrong. And if the fan base can come to terms with it, the creative team can use it to better the future of the franchise, not by appeasement, but by simple improvement. Case in point, Scream 2022 was amazing. I mean, to me, that was the best Scream sequel we had gotten at that point, which is saying something considering the rest of them were directed by Wes Craven. I mean, look, I did a video on this over a year ago. You can go check it out. Love that movie. But Scream 6 is miraculously even better. That doesn't mean I think less of Scream 2022, Scream 5, whatever the hell we're calling it now, or that it's bad. It means that radio silence took the things that worked for the fans in the last film, which for my money was nearly all the things, and fine-tuned them here in order to craft an even better film the next go-around, remixing the elements of a Scream film just perfectly enough to bring us something fresh. With Scream 5, radio silence had the insurmountable task of delivering the first Scream film in a post-Wes Craven world. They were hyper-focused on honoring the legacy of not only the Scream films as a whole, but the very essence of Wes Craven, and with Scream 5, they not only did that, they managed to put forth one of the most scathing and insightful commentaries on legacy and fandom. With Scream 6, radio silence has already laid down the foundation. They've firmly established a new era for Scream, but now they finally move out from the shadow of the original and its creator in order to chart a new path forward that is confidently their own. And while they don't kill the past to the point where Scream 6 is indistinguishable from its predecessors, they aren't beholden to the same rules of the franchise. I'm inclined to say that Scream 6 is the best sequel we have gotten in this franchise, and far beyond that, it blew every expectation I already had for this movie out of the water. I don't know how they did it. I don't know how they're going to keep doing it. I mean, these guys are something special. They are magic. The opening to a Scream film is one of the most important parts of each of these respective films. There's a standard to be set and subverted. It gets to a point, though, where the subversion reverts to the classic situation happening. You get the opening with Samara Weaving in this movie, a great callback to Drew Barrymore in the original Scream, and another very popular actress. But as opposed to Scream 2022, she dies. It is a classic Scream opening until the post-kill. In the post-kill, we immediately unmask our ghost face. Unheard of, absolutely wild. Thousands of questions are racing through our mind. Will we follow this ghost face the whole movie? Is the subversion of the mystery actually knowing the culprit the whole time? Will we get an extended giallo monologue from our boy Tony here? Then the other shoe drops, and yet again, everything is put on its head. Tony is then hunted by our real ghost face, killed off by a superior horror villain. Not even who you thought the villain was going to be is safe. No one is safe. We're not in a sequel, we're in a fully blown franchise now, baby. Boosting the IP by killing main characters so the franchise lives on. Tara and Sam could die, along with the rest of the core four. It's par for the course for the Scream films to play with horror tropes. Some of the films in the series do it better than others, but Scream 6 is one of the most successful, arguably only behind the original. It starts with the setting, where the film makes some fairly minor changes that have a big impact. Of course, this entry takes place entirely in New York City, which is a first for the franchise. Yes, Scream 3 was set in LA. Yeah, Scream 2 takes place at a college in Ohio. But these movies haven't really gone to big metropolitan centers before. That is what's a first for this series, and something as distinct as New York, where you really need to bring the city to life, that's a first. It's never happened. And especially in a genre film, when you set your movie in New York City, people expect all the trimmings from the Great Apple, whether it's Times Square, the Empire State Building, all the hustle and bustle of the city punctuated by the horror kills, with the city ultimately serving as little but an aesthetic backdrop. The idea of unfamiliar territory for the main characters rather than an actual change of scenery or a loss of home court advantage. People, myself included, probably expected a riff on Jason Takes Manhattan, which plays right into that exact cliche. Scream 6 couldn't be further removed from that though. It does what any good Scream film does and reaches higher. It doesn't just give us the superficial movie New York, it actually tries to put its characters and us there. It's more authentic to real New York life and locales. Sure, New York is a richly cultured city and it has a lot of landmarks, but the majority of New Yorkers don't spend their entire lives in front of Central Park or 1 WTC. The subway and small little corner shops become an integral part of city living as it does for these characters. And of course, more importantly, the nature of the kills, plus the setup that leads us to them, and especially the continued trend to play around with plot and story structure, all combine to not only effectively play with our expectations of horror films, but with our expectations of a Scream movie. This Ghostface has no rules and will break into a public place and kill everyone. He uses guns too. He's unpredictable and more threatening, and holy shit, the tension and paranoia is amazing. It's really effective at making us feel the PTSD and paranoia of the heroes. This ties into a nice subplot surrounding survivors, with the reality, despite the world around them sensationalizing their trauma, being that they are more than just what happened to them. Ghostface is the literal ghost of the franchise. It haunts these people and comes knocking at their door at every turn. It's a constant battle to ward off and keep the demons at bay. You can either let it control you or control it. The film is almost more about Ghostface than anything. What does he represent? What will allow him to be the face of the franchise? It's honestly fascinating because he usually isn't the face on the poster. Yeah, Ghostface might be lingering in the back or whatever, or maybe a tease poster will be, but the focus since the very beginning has always been on our protagonists. It's a fight to make sure he doesn't take over. The brilliance of Scream 6 is how it interrogates the very nature of a mask. The big question at the heart of these movies is always, who is the killer behind the mask? Who's hiding behind fear and clinging to the past and weaponizing it? Who's trying to force their worldview onto others? Scream 6 interrogates this and then asks, what if this time the survivor reclaims the mask that torments them? It's about reclaiming the lives that were taken from them and moving forward. And we, as a society, have to let them move on. We can't judge or put them in a box or pity them or treat them differently. We need to let them move past it all. They are more than just the 3 days of horror they experience. All that shared trauma is found tenfold in Gale, who keeps being Gale. She's tried to sell the movie rights to the events of the previous movie, failed to do that, and so did what she does best, and that is write a book about it. Ghostface even plays with her, saying that she would have made a good killer, even more so than Sydney or Dewey, due to her insecurity and instability. Afraid without Ghostface, her life is going to fade away. So much of this film, specifically the survivor subplot, deals with empathy, in finding that empathy in another person and seeing them as a complete individual and not just a surface level thing. The first killer, the fake Ghostface, was mad that his teacher gave him a C in his film studies class. He stopped seeing her as a person and stabbed her to death for absolutely absurd reason. When describing the kill, he said he stopped seeing her as a person. She just became a piece of meat, like an animal. When the tables are turned and he's the victim, however, Ghostface asks, "Do you feel like an animal?" as he repeatedly stabs him. I guarantee you, in that moment, he did not. He felt pain. He was vulnerable and afraid. He was human. If that isn't a microcosm of what the larger film is saying, I don't know what is. So often we see people through a screen, through social media, view them one-dimensionally. We view them via whatever manufactured persona they've constructed for themselves or what the public has constructed for them. You can't get the full picture online. People are complicated, and there's always more to the story, which makes Gale's new book even more of an irresponsible thing, given she's a journalist and supposed to be a deliverer of truth and empathy. We see this through the treatment of Sam and, on the flip side, how Richie's family viewed him. They only saw one side of him. They saw one side of the story. The daughter of a family of killers killed their son, and that is what they view the situation as, rather than looking at the full picture and at the truth. This ties into Gale and Kirby, who are both supporting characters in previous films, never given their due, taking on more prominent roles and proving their ability as leading ladies in their own rights, arguably more capable and far too underestimated. This is a great legacy and new cast combination. I honestly think for all the apprehension we had going into this film about Sydney not being there, I'm glad she wasn't. Now, I'm not glad that she's not in the film because she wasn't paid what she was owed, and there's a lot of head scratching going on there, but I think the story, in order for the franchise to move forward, did need to leave Sydney behind, and they give a compelling reason as to why she's not there, and it allows characters like Gale and Kirby to step into the light. They're able to come together with the core four from the requel film and look out and support one another, because that's what survivors do. They have great strength, and for Gale, she has to learn to stop fearing irrelevance and reinvent herself apart from Ghostface and tragedy exploitation. In a larger context, this film is also, again, a pretty strong indictment of toxic fandom. The strangest part about the Scream franchise is that within the movies exist through Stab, but that series has more installments and went off the rails in strange directions. I mean, Stab 6 apparently had a time travel angle, but the fans are obsessed with returning it to their roots, to give the franchise a story to be based on. The people who inspired the real-life events of the Stab series aren't people with lives to them. They're characters in a larger narrative that only exists to entertain. They don't have empathy for the victims. They don't see their humanity. They're just a victim. If anything, they're an obstacle getting in the way of the sensationalized tale of murder they want to tell, as if the killer did them a favor by committing the murder and getting them out of the way. It's fetishizing and trivializing murder and horror, and it's a widespread thing in Western society now, one which is so easy to get caught up in. I mean, look at all the serial killer fanatics and lovers and the obsession with true crime. It's kind of weird, right? Like, that's not okay. Like, these are lives. These are people who died in a horrific tragedy. In the film, Gale has to learn she's got that problem too, and when she stops indulging in it, she becomes a new and better person. These crimes are heinous. They deserve to be investigated and documented, but behind every single one of them is a human story, a person who lived a life and loved and was loved and cared and was cared for. That can't just be brushed aside. It's something the Scream films have been well, screaming at us from Casey Becker onwards. And like in real life, when we stop seeing these characters as human, we lose empathy, and then the stories do as well. It loses the very thing the franchise was about. We cannot lose the human elements, and if these films ever do lose the human element, I mean, we're dead in the water. Fans have to remember the empathy that made them fall in love with these works of fiction in the first place. Not just Scream too, because I do think that Scream fans tend to accept these movies and go along and are excited about the commentary and stuff, but look at Star Wars, The Matrix, James Bond, Godzilla, Indiana Jones, Marvel, DC, any IP that's become a franchise that has a fandom. We can't be like the assholes in the film who pigeonhole Sam. Sam stops becoming a person in the eyes of the media, and that takes a toll. And she in turn stops feeling like a person herself. Even her therapist judges her and isn't willing to hear her out and be a good therapist, do what these people are supposed to do. Tara struggles with all of this too, but masks her pain and tries to soldier on. But Sam has it much worse because of her lineage and public perception, neither of which she can even control. She didn't ask to be Billy Loomis's daughter, but she is. Just like survivors don't ask to be targets in a tragedy, someone with a questionable lineage did not ask to be born into it, and we cannot automatically pigeonhole someone because of it. Legacy is defined by action, not lineage. But from an outside perspective, sometimes all they boil down to is your lineage. There are multiple killers in Sam's bloodline. The central question of this story is, with the whole world around her shunning her before the fact, will she make the decision to break the curse, to change the outcome, to be something different than what's expected of her? And of course, ultimately she does, breaking free not only of the Loomis curse, but of the image unfairly projected on her. And it's more than her just not being a killer. It's Sam's moment where she insists on being her own person, reclaiming the curse and iconography stapled to her and making it her own. She will always be Billy Loomis's daughter, and she will always have had her trauma happen to her. And there are elements of both those things that will never fully be gone. But she's managed to not let it define herself. Comparing her directly to Richie and his legacy is about as clear as mud. He did not come from a family of murderers, even though by the end of this film he most definitely did. His problems come more from obsession, coddling, and a bit of privilege. His family encouraged his obsession with the Stab franchise and the real-life murders that created them. He created his own movies, and his cop dad got the evidence from the crime scenes. The obsession runs deep, and the family never saw it as a problem. They only saw it as a way to help Richie express himself. So once Richie is killed because he had become an actual murderer, they can't accept that he was in the wrong. He was just passionate, he cared so much about these movies, but obsession is unhealthy, and turning a blind eye to it all is no better. The idea that this was a family endeavor where they could all bond is downright revolting. This was both a way to get vengeance and to show what has become of these people now that their moral values have been pushed so far. Their legacy is what poisoned them all. Sam, meanwhile, comes from a lineage of murderers, and all everyone ever expected of her was to be one as well. In their eyes, she's nothing more than a different version of Billy before her. Maybe the way out this time, as she puts it, is to let Ghostface win. Sam is willing to sacrifice herself so that others can survive. It is the exact opposite of who Billy was, who would stab his own friend at the climax of the original film just so he could get away.
Fucking hit me with a phone, dick!
This is also a really magnificent allegory for Scream's legacy sequels themselves, especially 5 and 6, stepping out of the shadow of the original, but not severing their ties to it completely. You could even apply this whole concept to how the Scream films break free of the expectations set upon them, not only by the horror genre, but by the idea of what a film franchise is supposed to be. A lot of fans expect nothing but the same, and arguably actively desire things to stay the same. They don't allow the things they love to grow, to become something else, which is what kills so many movie franchises, because they capitulate to a vocal minority and recycle the same stories. With Richie embodying the more toxic side of fandom, well, he was a man baby. He was never allowed by his family to grow because of how coddled he was by his family, and he allowed movies to treat him the same way. He was comfortable with horror films treating him a certain way, and it needed to be like that always, otherwise he'd be lost. And I think it's pretty safe to say that he needed that in his life as well, which is why he became a psychopath. The Stab series could never try to be something else in his eyes, otherwise it would just be something to rail against. He placed those films on an unshakable pedestal, just like how his family placed him on a pedestal. He can never do any wrong. No, this is Richie, this is our kid. We've done everything we can to coddle him. In a lot of ways, that's what we as film fans so often do when we don't like the direction a franchise goes in, or even just in response to the audacity that a franchise might dare to change at all from what we're used to. We don't meet the film or the filmmaker where they're at. We don't even really engage with the work fairly, and instead find a nitpick, a single line of dialogue, a single moment in the story that rings false to our sensibilities as a fan, and we just use that as a scapegoat to beat down the entire film and say, oh, that sucks. Why, rather than such reactionary hollow nonsense, do we not meet the filmmaker where they are and look at why that choice was made in the context of the film, in the context of the whole story? We should engage with their art on a human, empathetic level, and we haven't been doing a great job of it in a lot of instances. And for as influential as these movies are, for as many films have lifted from them and tried to recapture lightning in a bottle, and I think there are many ways in which Scream 2 through 4 are guilty of this too, it also feels like a message that the horror genre has obtusely ignored, which doesn't help. It's fitting and it's awesome that Scream 6 takes that and also funnels it into the way we interact with film franchises, especially ones where the face of it has become a myth rather than a fully fleshed out character who we're able to relate to. That's not even specific to horror, that's blockbuster filmmaking in any genre. Oh, Luke Skywalker would never consider ruthless violence against a dangerous Padawan. Well, sure, maybe not if he's the ideal perfect Jedi on a pedestal we hold him up to, but didn't he hack his own father's hand off in a moment of sheer rage? Oh, you can't kill James Bond, he's invincible. Sure, if he's the superhero a sizable portion of Bond fans mistake him to be, except Ian Fleming didn't write a superhero, he wrote a deeply flawed and damaged human being whose entire life was set in motion by losing his parents and his humanity shrouded under a veil when the first human being he opened up to on anything close to a similar level betrayed him. I don't see an invincible superhero, I see a man. If he ever found a family or true love again, would never let himself lose it again at all costs. Yes, he would die to protect both of those things at once. Of course, his death would be defined by the thing that defined his life. And those are just two recent examples that caused massive outrage when The Last Jedi and No Time to Die released. But back to Scream. Sam can't be held down by the ghost of her father. Tara refuses to let her trauma rule her desire to have a normal life, and the audience needs to let their franchises take on new lives of their own. Sam is a killer, but she's one with a code, and I think that represents the perfect marriage of the old and the new, remixing what came before and not being beholden to it. This is also seen by the legacy characters being the side characters here, living in the shadow of Sydney or some of the other protagonists in the Scream franchise. Legacy doesn't always have to be a bad thing. Sam will always have that killer temptation, but she chooses not to be Billy. And that's a brilliant twist within a twist. I have always believed, and Scream 6 really just affirms it for me, stronger than ever before, or that these movies are directly imploring us to stop letting our fan love hinge on superficial issues and to get away from the groupthink and memes and talking points that get endlessly parroted about franchises and about specific entries. Holding a horror franchise up to God-like standards is ridiculous. The idea that nothing can top it and then it can only be one thing is borderline moronic. These films are love letters to horror cinema. Hell, they're love letters to movies and filmmaking, using its characters and allegories, putting them through the ringer and asking them to move forward. Just as Ghostface calls to Sam, we have to choose not to succumb to our hangups, to move past our pain, our trauma, our biases, our expectations, and we can't allow ourselves to be haunted by our ghosts. You can take that at surface level, and it's cathartic, it's powerful, and that's completely valid, especially if the messaging of Scream 6 helps you move beyond whatever ghosts are haunting you. But if you're a Scream fan who's longing for the good old days of the original film, or hates the sequels and wishes they didn't exist, maybe treat that as your ghost, and hear Radio Silence out. You just might wind up surprised.